a good critical mass here, so we will go ahead. Welcome to another in our series of speakers who are helping us think about the future of libraries, archives, and museums in an increasingly complex digital information world. As many of you know, this series is helping the Smithsonian Library celebrate our 40th anniversary, 40 years since former Secretary S. Dillon Ripley established us as a separate administrative unit with a centralized system. I'm honored that this series is co-sponsored by the Smithsonian Institution Archives and the Office of the Chief Information Officer, and I thank Anne Van Camp and Anne Spire for their support. I remind you that this presentation is being webcast, so hello to all of you who aren't present here in the room, and I hope that you enjoy this speech as well. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I want to draw your attention to the next in our series, which is coming very soon. On Monday, November 3rd at 10 a.m. in the Meyer Auditorium of the Freer Gallery of Art, we'll hear from David Lankes, Director of the Information Institute of Syracuse and an Associate Professor in Syracuse University's School of Information Studies. He has spoken and written widely about bridging the gap between the theory of library service and the practice of users through his concept of, quote, participatory librarianship. But I think his talk will resonate beyond libraries to practices in archives and museums, so I hope to see you all there and bring all your friends. Now to the main business. Roy Tennant is Senior Program Officer for OCLC Programs and Research, where his present portfolio involves working with partner institutions to help re-engineer our infrastructure for the needs of the 21st century. The OCLC Online Computer Library Center, for those of you who may not know, is a nonprofit membership computer library service and research organization dedicated to the public purposes of furthering access to the world's information and reducing the rate of rise of library costs. A very important. Whoops. Sorry about that. I hit something. There we go. That's almost thrown me for a loop. It's not the end of the world as we know it. So OCLC has more than 69,000 libraries in 112 countries and territories around the world. These libraries use OCLC services to locate, acquire, catalog, lend, and preserve library materials. Now, the Smithsonian Libraries is one of those members, and much of our catalog data comes from borrowing the work of other libraries through OCLC. And like all of us, OCLC is exploring ways to make our cataloging data more widely accessible through the OCLC Grid Services Initiative, which is working to expose the data contributed by OCLC members in useful ways so that it can be mashed up and remixed on the fly into enriched local services. Our investment in our library catalogs to continue to be relevant to today's information world, which means moving that data out where the users are and where they want to be. Roy is also the owner of the Web4Lib and XML4Lib electronic discussions and the creator and editor of Current Sites, a current awareness newsletter published every month since 1990. His books include Technology in Libraries, Essays in Honor of Anne Grodzins-Lippo, a wonderful woman and leader in the field, Managing the Digital Library, XML in Libraries, Practical HTML, a self-paced tutorial, and Crossing the Internet Threshold, an instructional handbook. That was published back in 1993, which I think probably sounded the call for us to be moving in many of the directions we are today. Roy wrote a monthly column on digital libraries for Library Journal for a decade. I saw that he had just stopped recently. And he's written numerous articles in other professional journals. And he is an award winner. In 2003, he received the American Library Association's LIDA/Library High Tech Award for Excellence in Communication for Continuing Education. Now, that's his professional resume. But I can tell you that he shares personal information widely on the Internet, so that we know he recently celebrated his 25th wedding anniversary at the Banff Springs Hotel in Canada with his wife, Gina Kuklis, who is a principal of Kuklis PR. I think that PR has rubbed off on Roy. And that he's the father of, I think, 15-year-old twin girls, whom I'm sure keep him hopping. So please join me in welcoming to the Smithsonian, Roy Tennant.
Thank you, Nancy. And my girls do indeed keep me hopping, for sure. I'm going to get off probably on a bad start here by telling you something you already know, and that is you have an unbelievably cool place to work. I mean, I can't believe coming to a place to work where you can see something amazing like every day. That just seems incredible to me. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to come here or to watch the webcast, and hi to the webcast folks. I want to begin today actually with a little movie I put together, which I think hopefully will set a little bit of the stage and get us to think a little bit about the future, what it might hold, and also take a look at what's happened in recent times, which I think if we look back even just 10, 15 years, we'll see just how far we've come in a short length of time. So bear with me a moment here.
That's great, it starts with an earthquake, birds and snakes, an airplane, and Lenny Bruce is not afraid. I have a hurricane, listen to yourself, churn, world serves its own needs, dummy serve your own needs, beat it up an ox, speed, grunt, no strength, the ladder starts to clatter with fear, fight down, high wire and a fire, represented 7 games, and a government for hire and a combat site. Left to us are coming in a hurry with the furies breathing down your neck. Team by team reporters baffle Trump, Kevin Croft, look at that, no claim, fine, then, overflow, population common food, but it'll do, save yourself, serve yourself, world serves its own needs, listen to your heart, breathe, dummy with the rapture and the reverend and the right, you patriotic, slam, fight, right, might feel it, pretty sight. It's the end of the world as we know it, it's the end of the world as we know it, it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. 6 o'clock TV hour, don't get caught in foreign tower, slash and burn, return, listen to yourself churn, locking in uniform and book, burning blood, letting every motive escalate, automotive incinerate, light a candle, light a motive, step down, watch your heel crush, this means no fear, cavalier, renegade, steer clear, tournament of lies, offer these solutions, offer the alternatives, and I decline. It's the end of the world as we know it, it's the end of the world as we know it, it's the end of the world as we know it, I feel Bernstein, Leonard, Brasnap, Lenny Bruce, and Lester Banks, birthday party, cheesecake, jelly bean, boom, you symbiotic, patriotic, slam, button, that, right? It's the
Well, I had fun doing that. I did that for a few reasons. One is I wanted to, first of all, prove how fun but difficult it can be to predict the future, and so I had fun predicting the future there. But in fact, probably none of those things will come to pass, but a whole different set will. A couple other points about that. One is it is the end of the world as we know it, and also I feel fine. I'm actually quite optimistic about our future, but we also have to make it and not sit back and have it visited upon us. So my talk today is going to be a lot about how I think we need to do that. First of all, a couple of things before we begin. I want to acknowledge my debt to Larkin Dempsey for some of these slides, and of course there's many other people who I draw upon, their ideas and so forth. Also, I may lay out some rather stark challenges, but I want to make the point that, again, that in fact I am an optimist about our future. And I do think our best days are still ahead of us. But we have to really dig in and change some ways fundamentally in how we do things. So I want to bear with me for a minute because I'm just going to recast some of the history of libraries in about 3 minutes, and this comes as no surprise to probably any of you, but I want to build up to a particular point that I wish to make. So if we go back to, say, the Library of Alexandria, where that was comprised of scrolls and such not, which were unique in the world. In fact, that led to the great tragedy of the fire there, where we lost an amazing amount of our cultural heritage because there were no copies of those. A lot of those scrolls are in that library. We come into medieval times, we had these scriptoriums in the monasteries where monks would painstakingly make copies by hand of cultural materials, of manuscripts, and so forth. And so we started to see that we could replicate knowledge and diffuse it and disperse it into the world. But it took a long time to do that. It was, of course, very painstaking and very difficult. Then we finally got to, of course, the Gutenberg Revolution, which was that we could actually start printing large numbers of copies of things through the invention of movable type and presses. And that, of course, was a major revolution because it suddenly took our cultural heritage and made it so much easier to disperse around the world than it had been before. Then kind of moving into the area of our 1700s, say, here in America. This is Jefferson's library in Monticello. We found that people could actually collect their own personal libraries. So Jefferson, as you know, had quite the collection and eventually donated to form the Library of Congress. But it was still difficult to get your hands on enough of these things to really have a full grasp on all that we had available to you out there. So we had this guy, Benjamin Franklin. You may recognize him standing in front of the old post office building right over here. He, felt this pain in some detail. He realized he had his own collection of books, but there were so many others out there that he wished to also read. And so he started the idea of a library here in America where gentlemen could come together and put their libraries together, and so therefore all the people who donated their collections could then use other people's books. And that kind of became the impetus for libraries within the U.S. And one of the first ones here in Philadelphia, for example, the Free Library of Philadelphia. And that kind of led to this amazing, really amazing renaissance of access to cultural information through the creation of free public libraries. And for many, many years, that's kind of been where we've been. And we have shared the wealth with people around the world through various ways, including interlibrary loan document delivery. But one of the things I want you to consider here is that libraries, as they were created and as they have been substantiated over the years have been about one thing. They've been about scarcity of information and how we share that scarce information in ways that make it less scarce. Okay, but we have been founded on the fact that this information is hard to get. And we've made it our life's work to make it easier to get. But that's been our value proposition for all these years, has been the scarcity. Well, that's a problem. That's a problem for us now because now we live in a very different world. We live in a world where everything is interconnected. I shouldn't say everything. There are, of course, holes and whatnot. But for most intents and purposes, for people who live in modern societies, everything is getting connected up together. Okay? So that throws out a challenge for us. Because increasingly people are able to get virtually anything they want on devices like this that they put in their pocket. Okay? So they're able to get all kinds of things. Books, for example. As we saw in the movie, Google is digitizing millions of books. Many of those, of course not all, are available to anyone out on the internet. So if you have an iPhone, a BlackBerry, whatever, you can access that content and bring it up. They're not the only players in this. The Open Library is digitizing many books as well. And they have hundreds of thousands of books available in full text for free for anyone. These books are, of course, available to other kinds of devices. And the Amazon Kindle here is one such example. This is actually a clunky example. It's probably a bad example of the kind of thing we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to see bendable e-paper in various forms and devices where a page will, the print will disappear and another page will appear, and you won't have to worry about dropping it or anything like that. And it will be able to be in many different form factors. So that's the kind of future we're looking at. In the past, just again to take a quick look back again, we need to consider that in the past, when someone wanted information or a book or that kind of thing, there was really only one place they could go, and that was to the library. Okay? There's only one place where they could get that, and they had to come to us. Now, that's almost exactly flipped. They don't have to come to us. They can go to a place like this, increasingly, and get what they're looking for. Okay, so increasingly we are, in many cases, disappearing from our users' horizon. Now, my employer did this report, I believe it was in 2003 or 2004? Anyway, it looked at the perceptions of libraries among people. And one of the things that pointed out was that the only brand for libraries that had really any take-up at all was books. That is, when people think about libraries, they would think about books. If they think about museums, they're going to think about objects. If they think about archives, they're going to think about manuscripts. Okay, but this was focused on libraries, so it says our only brand is books. Now, it did say that there was a potential maybe to stretch that definition to encompass other kinds of things, but they weren't exactly sure. More study is needed. Now, keep that in mind as we kind of go through this, that for libraries, our only brand is books. So with this background, I went to this person's blog, Jessica Hagee, and she has this wonderful blog where she takes an index card and she just, puts a diagram on an index card and puts it up on her blog. And these things are often funny and insightful and cool, and they're very easy to understand because it just fits on an index card and it's a diagram. I was inspired by that while thinking about some of these issues. So I drew my own little index card thinking about some of this. And I was sitting there thinking, if our value proposition is based on scarcity of books and information, then we are in serious trouble. Because as information and books become easier to access over time, then potentially our value to society will decline because people will be able to get what we provide them in other ways. When someone wants a book, they're increasingly going to go to Google Books. Okay? When someone wants information, they're increasingly going to go to Google and other search engines. Where does that leave us? Okay? So, if we rest on our laurels, if we rest on the fact that our value proposition is scarcity, then I will tell you we will go down. Okay? But that's not what I'm here to tell you. I'm here to tell you that there is, in fact, hope. Because I'm here to say that our value proposition of the past is not and should not be our value proposition for the future. And so we must leave this scarcity idea behind and embrace ubiquity. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is how we can embrace being ubiquitous, how libraries, museums, and archives can be in the user's workflow when, where, and how they want us to be, so that they will continue to value us as they have valued us over the centuries. So my basic proposition here is we must be everywhere, or we will, in fact, end up nowhere. What does being everywhere mean? Well, it clearly means being here. And there's various ways we can do that, and I'll talk about some of those ways and give examples that are based within museums and libraries. This is a great place to be. I am so happy to see you here, that you've got materials from your collections in Flickr, because that's increasingly where people find stuff. If they want images, they go to Flickr to find images. They don't necessarily come to your websites. They don't necessarily come to my websites. They go to these large aggregations of content that they know, where they know they can find something that they want, rather than try to ferret out every little website that has images on it that they think they might want. So really happy to see you here. We also need to be in spaces that our users increasingly inhabit. So for example, this is Facebook. How many of you have a Facebook page? Cool, okay. I'm glad that all of you do, because you at least know where a lot of your users are coming from, the kinds of things that they interact with. So we have, OCLC has this WorldCat Facebook application where someone can search the catalog of 110 million records and over 1.29 billion holdings straight from their Facebook page. Okay, they can embed this in their Facebook page, search WorldCat from there, and find if their local library has a book. Likewise, we have a Facebook application where if someone has a citation, or a book that they want to cite, they can enter a search and get the citation back in various formats and styles. So they can just copy that and paste it in their paper, for example. Folks love that kind of thing, where they don't actually have to type out the citation and worry about the format. Twitter. Does anyone Twitter here in this room? A few? Okay. Twitter is one of these weird little things that I am still trying to figure out what it means to me. But it's an interesting thing that libraries are messing around with. This is the Lunar and Planetary Institute library. And I don't know if you can see here, but they notice that they've got 431 followers. That means they have 431 people who, when they're in Twitter, and you can get these notices on your phone if you want, in text messages or on the web or in various different ways. When the Lunar and Planetary Institute posts something to their Twitter page, then 431 people get notified. Okay? So that's an interesting way for libraries to potentially have a presence within user workflow. Sites like this are increasingly popular with people. So that's just another example. We certainly need to be in this kind of space. And I think we've seen, with the revolution of the iPhone and BlackBerries and various other kinds of devices like that, that people will increasingly be accessing the internet and all its various services from a handheld device. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are there as well, and people can find library, museum, and archive material from their handheld device. So again, we're exposing the WorldCat database through an iPhone application. So this just shows various parts of its functionality. One of the things that you can do, of course, is find out if your local public library has a particular book. So you can set your zip code, for example, and then the application will tell you if your local library has it, and you can then click through to the library and potentially put it on hold or whatever. So hopefully you're getting the idea of being out in the user's workflow and then drawing them back in to your collections, because that's going to be a continuing theme here this morning. Now, I'm not telling you this simply for survival. Okay, survival's nice, but we need to go beyond that. We actually need to create the future that we want to inhabit. Okay, so I think that's one of our challenges now, is to think about the future we wish to have in 5, 10, 15 years. How do we wish to interact with our users? How do we wish to expose our collections? How do we wish to draw them back into our spaces? Because although I haven't touched on this before, I want to make it clear that I understand that our spaces are heavily used. I just want to keep them that way. I want to make sure that we can keep bringing people into our spaces and use our collections, which I think will only increase if we do these things right. So some themes I'm going to kind of hit on over the next few minutes here is one of the biggest is we need to leverage the opportunity of the network. And that means a couple things. One of them means operating well at the network level. So that means participating, for example, in large-scale aggregations. The fact that you put some of your digitized collections into Flickr is a great example of that. You are participating in a large-scale aggregation in order to get attention and draw people back down into your collections, either in person or on the web. We need to get into the user's workflow. As I've kind of alluded to or mentioned, being out there in spaces where they are found, on their Facebook pages or in their Twitter or whatever, whatever seems like an appropriate channel for us to be there to interact with our users. This is going to mean re-engineering infrastructure, which is something that I think a lot about, and also along the way reallocating staff. And we actually have an opportunity coming up. Many of our institutions have an aging workforce. I can tell you this because I'm one of them, and that is going to be retiring over the next 5, 10 years. So we'll have a chance to, as people retire and we hire new staff, to actually change the jobs, have them do something different when you hire in new people, and refocus the human energy of the organization on some of these things that we're going to be talking about. And then we also, realizing that we have physical spaces, we need to make those even more inviting. And there's various ways that libraries and museums and archives are doing that. And you guys are doing that. Certainly well, at least the museum, the institution is, with some of these. I noticed the building over there, Natural History Museum, you're tearing out ceilings and putting in this whole new exhibit. And that's a good way to draw in users. So in the past, again, users came to us. They kind of built their workflow around us because that was the only game in town. And now they've got all kinds of opportunities, and we need to think about how to be in their workflow in useful ways for them. In the past, we really could not do massively centralized services. We really did need to distribute collections, for example, in physically dispersed locations. So we had to have a network of local libraries with local copies of books, because that was really the only effective way to get material to people. Now what we're seeing through massive digitization is that centralized services for at least some of this content really makes a whole lot of sense. Because in one centralized location where it can be backed up and maintained and so forth, it can serve anyone, anywhere, at least in a digital way. And we'll also see, in an interesting kind of twist, how that digital content is now going full circle back into print, which I think is absolutely fascinating and is exactly the right thing to do. So I've talked a lot about Google for, I think, probably obvious reasons, but it's important for us to realize that Google is just part of a larger ecology of all kinds of various services and internet sites and so forth that's out there. But there are some interesting lessons to be drawn from not just Google, but some of these other sites, Flickr, Delicious, and so forth. One is that concentration of data, scale really matters. The fact that Google went out and crawled not just the web pages, but also understands the linkages between those pages is what gave them the edge over all the other search engines. They could now tell us not just here's a page on this topic, but they could rank it based on who and how many sites are pointing to that page. Okay, and they can only do that by having massive scale. So when you do have massive centralization of data, there becomes all sorts of opportunities for using that data in interesting and effective ways. So scale matters, data concentration matters. There's some very interesting things that come from that. Then, kind of conversely, diffusion of information into other spaces is also something that really matters. Getting your data out of your silo systems into other places is also an important aspect of that. That spread and syndication matters. And there's various ways that you can do that, and we'll touch on some of those. Some of the benefits of concentration. We're seeing some of those in our own systems. For example, WorldCat itself ranks search results partly based on the number of holding libraries. So the more libraries hold a book, the more important it is in the search result, and the higher it appears within the search results. Usage data might be terribly interesting to know about. Might be terribly interesting to aggregate over a large swath of institutions and see what people are actually using and use that to help sweeten the ranking. Recommendations related books. A person who checked this book out also checked out that book. Okay, there's becomes some possibilities we can do with concentration of data. User contributed data is an interesting new area that a number of sites are using quite effectively. For example, Library Thing. Users can tag books, users can review books, they can do all kinds of things around books, and they then take that data and do some interesting things with that information. Libraries can be collaborating and cooperating on that as well. We've also seen, and we'll take a look at a study here in a minute done by the Steve Museum Project, where user-contributed data can actually be made better. We can actually do more things with it. And then we can also attract attention and redirect it. And to some degree, that's really within the library world, that's what WorldCat increasingly does, attract attention and redirect it back to the individual library collections. So I mentioned the ranking here. Number of holding libraries makes items sift higher within WorldCat. Some interesting things we're able to do because we have so much data to work with is we create pages around authors. So here's this person, Walt Disney, and we know, for example, that we have information on 7,398 works. They're published in 40 languages and so forth, and we can aggregate a lot of information about this individual on one page, including this publication timeline you see that demonstrates kind of that person's life within literature. Subjects and how many books, how many items have been cataloged under the various subjects. The larger they are, the more items are available under those topics. So in other words, we can start mining the data for some very interesting things. And this is just the beginning of some very interesting data mining things that we will be able to achieve. I mentioned the Steve Museum Project. This is a very interesting project where they put a number of art reproductions up on the web and then invited people to tag them, invited people to assign topic terms to those objects of art. And one of the interesting things that I think they found was that you could pretty much statistically figure out which terms were valid over kind of a broad swath of people, because as the tags fell off in numbers, they became more and more, less and less applicable perhaps on a broad scale to that object. So here we have over here Winslow Homer, the Gulf Stream. The top tags there were boat, storm, sharks, all items that seem inarguably about that item. And then, as you got down to where a term occurred once, then maybe it was less useful in terms of describing that item. So I think what we're seeing is, and LibraryThing has discovered this as well, is that you can start looking at, as you gather more data from users, you can do statistical manipulation with that and figure out which terms actually matter and which perhaps don't within a collective context. Now, another benefit of concentration is this ability that we're trying to provide to our member institutions of kind of being a switching service. So I want to just demonstrate this switching service, how it would work out on the open web. So I was traveling, I think it was like last year, and I happened to read this blog post by my colleague where he's talking about this biography, and he linked the biography, is mentioned in the biography, to the WorldCat page for that book. So from reading this blog page out there on the web, I made one click here, which took me here to this page for this book and WorldCat. WorldCat knows my zip code because I've set that before. So as soon as I landed on this page, I saw that in fact my local library has the book. I then clicked that link and was quickly able to see that the book was in my local branch, 5 miles away from my house, and it was checked in and was on the shelf. Okay, so that is from the blog post to WorldCat to my library, where I saw that it was on the shelf, was like 2 clicks. Okay, that's really cool. Now, the only click lacking was the last click, which was send it to my house. And if we can do that, and I actually think that we can, then there would be no tax measure that I would not vote for to support this library, because it would be so cool and so important to me that I could just go 3 clicks from the wild internet and have that book on my doorstep. By the time I got home from my travel, it would be there. That would be so cool. And we're only 1 click away. Okay. So, some bad news. Well, our data is actually worse than we think. And I hate to use such a trivial example, but here's one in which we talk about how you would use a modem to access this particular source. And of course, no one does that anymore. Okay? I mean, if you have a 2400 baud modem, you're in a world of hurt. So, we have data, and we have erroneous data, not just outdated data. We have bad data. The good news, though, is that we're getting a lot better at doing machine manipulation of that data to improve it. Okay? So an example of this, again, I go to what I know, which is how we have controlled name headings within WorldCat. So Tom Hickey, who's part of OCLC research, wrote some algorithms to go through the entire WorldCat database and improve and link up headings, that is, authors and creators, folks like that, to control them. So in other words, to actually use authority control, so we know that, for example, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens are the same person, and those kinds of linkages are properly made. Okay, so there are things we can do programmatically. And that kind of activity is ongoing at OCLC, where we try to comb through all the records in the database and make systemic changes. Now, I want to talk about mass digitization because this is just a huge potential here for libraries, museums, and archives. And I don't think I necessarily need to tell you that, but there's some interesting things about that. One is we need to fight this illusion that everything is online because it's not. But increasingly, if it's not online, then it's going to be lost to the majority of people who think that it is. And we see time and again examples of this where, people do a search in Google, and if they don't find something there, they don't think it exists. I was in the bar having dinner last night, and some gentleman who is not connected with libraries at all gave me a story that said pretty much exactly that. He had heard this speaker talking about how he gave an assignment to his students, and college students, by the way, and the assignment was to go find information about this thing that happened in 1736. Well, they came back and said, every single one of them came back and said, we can't find anything on it. Okay? The teacher said, that is absolutely ridiculous. And they said, well, we searched the internet and we couldn't find anything. And the teacher had to inform them that not everything is on the internet. They actually needed to go to the library, to the archives, and find the information that is not on the internet, that is only in print. So that was an object example of this problem, and one that we need to fight against. So, of course, we know, I don't need to tell you, this announcement here digitizes full collection, which, God help you. It's a great goal. It was an error. Okay. But I am a fan of putting everything we can on the internet, and that's an important point about this, which I'll illustrate for you later on, is that I'm a firm believer that putting things on the internet does not reduce the value of the actual object. It increases it. Okay, it actually increases it. So, but let's hold that aside for now. There's, of course, we need to think about digitization a little bit differently than perhaps we have in the past. Not everything needs to have the kind of careful handling and painstaking operations that some materials require. So we might use some very slow and careful techniques with some materials. Some, for example, archival materials and so forth, although I would argue that for many archival materials, we should just, do some basic scans, get them up there. Don't worry about absolute perfect quality, because we're not doing it for preservation purposes. We're doing it for access. And so, therefore, the needs are less. For other things, we'll be doing this kind of, assembly line, mass digitization, just shoot the stuff through, sheet feeders, scanners like this from the Internet Archive, just to get the stuff out there and digitized, and that's appropriate. The University of Michigan is an interesting example of, I think, potentially how to do this kind of thing right, at least within a library environment. They are, of course, a Google library. They were one of the original Google 5. But they were one of the few, in fact, I think the only, to really take seriously their obligations to steward this content and do something useful with it on behalf of their users. So if you went to their library catalog, even just a couple years ago or a year or two ago, you would see that they had links here. One went to the Google version of a book, and one would go to their version of the book. And they put them up in different ways, so it was interesting to look at the differences between those two versions of the same scanned book. They would do different manipulations on them post-scanning. They would put them up within different interfaces and offer different options. So it was interesting to compare them. But I think even more importantly is where this is now leading. So I want to show a brief movie here from the University of Michigan about the next step they're taking towards this content. So they've got nowadays millions of digitized books that, of course, only some of those are free to everyone. Others are limited to University of Michigan users. But they're now taking the last step, which is to bring those digitized books back into print, which I think is fascinating. So we're just going to take a quick look at this movie here. Oops, that was interesting. Let's try this again. It went to my screensaver. That's bizarre. Okay, let's try this again.
This is a significant moment for book publishing and book. And we're essentially getting outside the limits of physical space, which has always limited what bookstores can do and what libraries can do. But you can store an infinite number of books digitally. And then if you have the option of producing print quickly and cheaply, you can still meet people's desire for a print book. So I think it's a much more democratic form of access. You don't have to be in an urban center. You don't have to be at a large academic institution to be able to get the books that you need. So the machine makes possible access to books in a way that it just simply hasn't been possible before. What it does allows you to print and bind a book in about 5 to 7 minutes. And that means that you can produce for users a book that is only existing in digital form and give them their own copy. And so especially rarer and harder to find books that people would have had to travel hundreds, thousands of miles to see, they can now actually purchase their own copy at a pretty inexpensive price. On Demand Books was interested in working with the University of Michigan because we have a considerable digital collection. These were books that were older, often in storage, not very often used. And we saw not only great use online, which we expected, hundreds of thousands of people a month were coming to look at these books, but what we didn't expect was that people also began to ask us if they could get a print copy. Well, the beauty of the Espresso book machine is that all of the machines that exist can be networked, and so as they get more Espresso book machines out into the world, any one of those machines could print a University of Michigan book if we permitted it. So a user in another country could walk up to an Espresso book machine at a local university and say, I want this book from the University of Michigan, and have it printed and delivered right there. So this is the hope of the machine.
So the interesting thing about this to me is that now we have hundreds of thousands and soon millions of out-of-print books, books that would not be, you couldn't get any other way except through a secondary bookseller or a library, would now be available for $10 each if you could pick it up at a local place. And if we just add mail charges onto that, not that much more you could send an out-of-print book to someone. So I think that's a fascinating example of a couple things. One is that putting books online doesn't necessarily mean that's the way they're always going to be consumed. The physical object will still have use and meaning for people, and there are going to be times when they want to either come to a museum and see the physical object or come and get the book or whatever. So an interesting full circle from print to digital back to print again. And I think that's really an interesting part of our future. Now, when we put digital content online, I think we mostly fall into the trap of thinking that people will come to our finely crafted portals to see our stuff. And in fact, they stay away in droves. They increasingly will find our content by it being syndicated out into spaces that they normally inhabit. So I would argue that we should not spend a lot of time and effort on finely crafted silos that so many of our organizations do, but focus more on how we can get information about the objects that we have digitized out into those spaces, out into those large aggregations, to diffuse it into the network where people increasingly live. Library museum holdings will get more exposure this way. Small libraries and museums can actually play in big spaces. So, for example, we end up pushing information about library, museum, and archive content into Google and into some of these large aggregations on your behalf. The more paths people can travel to get to you, the more visible you are to them and the more valuable you become to them. And then, of course, we can provide ways in which our users can make our stuff better. Someone the other day said, how can we create a library where every time a book is used, it gets better? Or information about that book gets better, what we can say about that book gets better, the use of it makes it better for everyone else that comes down the line. And we're starting to see ways we can do that, and that, I think, will be some interesting challenges for us going forward. Just to use some figures here to give you a sense of this, the blue line is Flickr, and this is traffic, internet traffic, and the red line along the bottom that you can barely see is the Library of Congress. So hopefully this gives you a sense of which of these portals people tend to go to more, okay? And that also illustrates the importance of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian putting digitized representations or content into these spaces. So an example here again, Flickr, the Library of Congress information, when they put it up, they found that users commented on it, and they were able to take some of those comments and plow them back into the descriptive records within the library catalog. So they were able to improve the descriptions of this content by user-contributed information. And they've kind of been doing this at, I don't know what the numbers are. They're actually still small right now, but it's been an interesting project for them to see how users could make information better. Also, in terms of syndicating out into other spaces, Google Books, you'll notice there's a link here, find this book in a library. That links out to WorldCat, which then can lead the person to the local institution or local organization that has the book. So again, trapping the user out there on the wild, woolly internet, guiding them back into our curated collections. And this, we can only achieve this kind of thing through large aggregations ourselves. The fact that you participate in OCLC makes this link possible, because we're big enough to sit at the table with Google and talk to them. You're lucky enough to be big to sit at a lot of tables too, but there are many small libraries that would never ever have the chance. And only by cooperating and working together do we have such a chance. The University of Washington Libraries did an interesting project where they would provide links within Wikipedia to digitized collections that they had at the University of Washington. So here's an example of the page on salmon in Wikipedia, and the top link here is to the University of Washington Library's salmon collection. So the link takes them here to their collection. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because if someone goes to Google and types in the one-word search salmon, guess what the top hit is? The Wikipedia page. So that means someone out there on the internet searching a site like Google for salmon is 2 clicks away from the University of Washington's digital collection on salmon. That, you cannot buy that kind of link love, okay? That's golden. And it gets people to their doorstep that otherwise would not find them. I mean, how many people start out thinking, I want to know about salmon, I'm going to trundle off to the University of Michigan Library website, plow around the page for a while, frantically trying to find digital stuff, and eventually get to the salmon collection. No one does that. I don't do that. Okay? It's stupid to think people will. So the only way we can get people to this stuff is by getting it out there in spaces where they can find it. Exposure means traffic. So here's another example where the Alaska State Library put their holdings in Open WorldCat. They've already had an increase in checkouts. Now, who would have thought? But it happens. Another example, the Northern Arizona University has this wonderful collection of digital photographs. Now, they happen to have some photographs of a side canyon from the Grand Canyon called Matkatameba. So if we do a search on Matkatameba, we find some photographs here of Matkatameba Canyon. Cool stuff, right? Well, the problem is, when you do a search on Matkatameba in Google, what do you find? Well, I can tell you, you do not find the Northern Arizona University Library photographs. You find this place called freelargephotos.com, which takes you to their photos of Matkatameba Canyon. This is my site. I personally have trumped Northern Arizona University because I happen to know one thing. I happen to know the importance of a sitemap. okay, in exposing my content to search engines where people can do searches within those search engines and be taken to my site. Northern Arizona University hasn't done that. So as far as users are concerned, they don't exist. I mean, users out there on the web, they don't exist, okay? This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, I also believe very firmly that online access creates interest in the real thing. The University of Michigan has definitely felt that need because they have installed that Espresso book machine. They realize that when people find a book digitally online, they often want to have a print copy of it, okay? So online doesn't necessarily obviate the need for the print in a book sense, and it certainly doesn't mean that people don't need to come to the museum to see the actual object. So let's look at an example, okay? There's probably no more recognized museum object in the world than Mona Lisa. You can see it everywhere, absolutely everywhere. One of my favorites is this one, which you might appreciate being here in DC. And, but what happens to the actual object? Have people lost interest in it? Do people not go and see it? I don't think so. It is, I think, it's probably the most visited thing within the Louvre Museum in Paris. Okay, and because of the exposure, not despite of, but because of the exposure, people want to see the real thing. So putting online, I submit, is going to increase traffic, physical traffic, to your collection. That opportunity there. But there's many different ways that we can enhance our physical spaces so that they become places where people actually want to spend time. And so I don't want to spend so much time on the digital that you think that I don't value that. I actually value our physical spaces quite a bit. They're often heavily used, and I think they will be increasingly used in the future as we get good at this business of putting data out on the web about our collections, about what we're about, so people will come to us and use our collections. So kind of an undercurrent of what I've been saying today is that I believe that we need to massively cooperate. This is an opportunity that we have to do much better together than we can alone. We can enable new efficiencies. We're going to see a lot of our workflows moving to the network level over the next few years. We're going to see that there's a lot to be gained from us all not doing the same things in our own little operations, but by doing them at the network level, we can do them more efficiently, we can do them more effectively, and we can do them cheaper. So for my mind, that next leap to the network level with some of our basic infrastructure kinds of things, checking in serials, checking out books, doing that kind of thing, if we can aggregate those operations, then I think there's efficiencies that we can squeeze out of the system that we can plow back into things that actually matter to real people. Okay, and it's not marking and parking that matters to people. It's getting access to the stuff, getting their questions answered. The kinds of things that we can provide in person are important. Increasing access to these cultural heritage kinds of objects, whether it be archival collections, museum collections, library collections, is going to be obviously increasingly important, because without that, again, these collections kind of disappear off of people's radars, and we certainly don't want that. We actually want to encourage people to come to our institutions. Now, one of the things that Nancy left out of my resume, it's hard to believe she left anything out, frankly. That was such a long and thorough introduction. Thank you, Nancy. Was that I'm a commercial whitewater guide, and one of the things I learned as a guide that has been an interesting aspect of my professional life as well is that if you don't all paddle together, you're in trouble. Okay? If all of your paddlers paddle at the same time, that's when you're most effective. And if you don't paddle at the same time, then disaster is likely to occur. Okay? So for me, that's a parable about cooperation. We can all work together, or we can have our own organizational disasters by working alone. Okay, so what to do? Just some summary advice of where I think we need to go, where our basic, where each institution needs to go. One thing I'm a big fan of is use your library, use your organization like a user would. Do not come in the back door. Come in the front door. Try to wipe your mind clean and imagine what someone sees through new eyes. Can you immediately discern where you need to go to do something? Can you figure out how to use your services? Is the signage useful and appropriate? Use your automated systems as if you're a new user. Try to find a book, check it out. Okay? I would submit if you do this on a regular basis, you will be just as frustrated as many of your users are. And you will understand where the problems are. But if you continue to use it as a staff person would, you're not going to see a lot of the frustrations. And if you see it with all of your knowledge intact, you're not going to see the puzzlement that most people have when they enter your organization. Also a big fan of trying to determine user requirements, user needs. And this is most often done by actually talking to people, which I recommend to anyone. And it's not necessarily something that requires a large infrastructure with staff and so forth to do user requirement studies. It can begin as simple as having a casual conversation with someone who's come into your organization, your library. And you can learn a lot from that, even just a number of informal contacts. So it doesn't have to be something that you allocate funds to support. It could be that simple. We also then need, once we have a good picture of what our user requirements actually are, and before I leave user requirements, I want to mention that it's not just the people who walk in your door. A lot of your users are not in your physical buildings. They're out there, so we can't forget them, and we need to perhaps make better efforts to figure out what their requirements are, because they can be very different than the people who actually darken your door. Then we also need to understand what opportunities technology offers. That's a tough one because there's a lot to learn, but it can be learned. And if we learn how to use technology effectively, then we can be more effective in what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, the fact that Northern Arizona University Library didn't know about sitemaps or didn't do them meant that they were basically not on the internet. I mean, people are not going to find their content to a large degree. So understand what technologies offer. Think imaginatively about how to bring those two things together, your user requirements and the technologies, and how to bring them together in more effective ways. And that's a lot of what I try to spend my day thinking about, and how to help you do that here. And of course, we need to continue to seek ways to expose our content, our services, wherever users are found, and increasingly they are found on the internet, and that's where we need to be in more effective ways. So again, in the past, we've been all about scarcity. And our value proposition to our societies, the folks who actually support us, is that we solve the problem to some degree of scarcity. And in a world in which we have no scarcity anymore, that cannot be our value proposition. Our value proposition must be based on ubiquity, because that is where things are today. And that is a useful way forward, and a way forward that I think will serve us well for many years to come. So that's what I came here today to tell you, and I appreciate your time and attention. And now I'll be happy to take some comments, questions, brickbats, what have you. I can duck behind the podium, so I'm safe. Whatever you have to say. Thank you. Way in the back? Oh, yeah, probably the mic is good. Webcast people would appreciate that, I'm sure.
I was wondering if you'd talk a little more about what web scale means in the discussion, because it's a term that gets used a lot, but I think when you're looking at, individual libraries, it's a little hard to picture what does that really mean.
Yeah, well, I think individual libraries will achieve web scale largely through participating in large aggregations. So what I'm suggesting is that, for example, OCLC as one prime example is a way to achieve web scale. So we're achieving web scale on your behalf in those spaces where we play. So that example of the link in Google Books, for example, that will bring people right back down to a local library, even very small local libraries, is a way of that small library achieving web scale by being part of that larger aggregation. So I think that's really primarily what I'm talking about, is achieving web scale through participation in large cooperatives that can provide that on behalf of each individual institution. I think it's very difficult for each institution to achieve web scale on its own. I mean, one way that they can do that is by participating in other large aggregations. For example, the image upload to Flickr is another example of achieving some web scale by participating in a large aggregation that is not based in a library environment, but is just one of those services out there on the web. So that's how I would go about achieving that. Martin.
Mine is sort of a follow-up question. A lot of the web scale things and mass aggregators are all basically .coms. OCLC itself is a .org that's fading into a .com, sort of, kind of.
Well, we could argue about that. But
so my question is, and I'm a great proponent of all of those things, but sometimes there's a little voice in the back of my head that says, what happens next?
Right. Ed, that's an excellent question, and I would fault you if you didn't ask it, or if you didn't ask it in your brain, even if you didn't ask me today. It is definitely something that we need to be aware of and cognizant of as we cooperate or we collaborate with some of these organizations. And that's part of what made me uncomfortable about the whole Google Books thing. But there's a couple points about that. One is that you still have your stuff. I mean, you still have what you had before. You're not giving up, or I would not give up anything that we have presently, which is management of our collections and so forth. So it's more like, adding something on. So if Google went away tomorrow, we should be sure that we still have our stuff. So for example, the University of Michigan and many of the other Google libraries put together the HathiTrust, which is where they will be putting our copies of the digital content so we can manage it, so that when Google does go away, which it probably inevitably will, either through loss of interest or being bought out or go under or whatever, we still have our versions of that stuff in our own control. So I think when we talk about participating in some of these efforts and these large aggregations, it's useful for us to think about what the exit strategy is and make sure we've got one. But beyond that, I don't think we need to worry about it. It's more like if they go away, fine, we've got our thing over here or whatever. Just know what that is and make sure you've planned for it. That's the way I'd look at that. And I would argue that although my employer does offer a lot of services, does vend a lot of services like a commercial company, we remain a cooperative and we remain a not-for-profit. So if you have problems with that, there's ways in which you can participate within the organization to make your voice heard, which you cannot do at Google or Circe Dynix. So. I don't suppose it's possible to get the webcast people to ask questions, is it? Yeah, back there. Yeah.
I was wondering what advice you would give people considering MLS programs as far as being part of this new revolution in libraries and digitization, the kind of programs you would advise, the classwork, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. Probably one best answered over drinks or something. Not that I can do that, I'm hitting the plane tonight, but anyway, I've written a few columns that speak to this a little bit. So perhaps one of the ways I can answer this is to have you email me, and I can send you links to those. But in short, I think within library school, first of all, there's going to be a limited set of things you're going to be able to learn in the short time you're there. But it would be useful for you to get some background on some basic things that I think are going to take us forward. One of those is XML. I think knowing about XML and how to process it and so forth is a skill for the future. We are increasingly passing information around in that format, in various schemas in that format, and so just knowing about it, how to use it, and so forth. I'm actually a fan of people learning a little bit of programming. Not that you would ever have to write programs yourself, but once you know something about programming, you can never have someone shit you over how long it's going to take to do something. And that's an important skill. So if you're a manager and someone comes in and says, well, it's going to take me, 5 weeks to do this, you can say, well, I know for a fact it could be done in 2 days, so what are you telling me here? And why is it going to take 5 weeks? So that can be important. And then I found it useful, even though I'm not employed as a programmer, I will sometimes write a little program to do something I need to have done that if I didn't know how to program, either would never get done, or I would have to try to, bribe or cajole or whatever, someone else to do it for me. So it's a useful skill, even if you're not going to be employed as a programmer. I would foster, this is something you're not necessarily going to be taught in library school, but I would foster a critical view of technology, not take up every new thing as if it's a shiny new toy, but look at it critically to see what it can do for you, how it may or may not fit in with what you're trying to do, what your goals are, and work on skills that will enable you to quickly get a sense of what a technology offers, but not have to go into it in great detail until you know that you really want to go to the next level. So I'm a fan of what I call strategic learning, which is, first of all, kind of keeping your eyes scanned on the horizon and know what's coming down the pike. Take a look at various things, just enough to get a sense of what they do or what they might do for you, and then use a filter. And if something doesn't seem like it's useful to you at this point, then don't bother with it anymore. But if it does look like something useful, then learn a little bit more about it, just enough to do some task you want to do, and then only learn as much as you need to do what you need to accomplish. And then scan back every now and then to see if things have changed, because often they have, and an initial assessment may no longer apply, and you'll have to reassess whether something is going to be useful to you or not. So in terms of coursework, I really don't know what to tell you there. It's also useful to know something about cataloging, just, structured description of materials, what that means, what that consists of. Maybe not exactly what, mark subfield to use within a particular instance, because that's all changing as we know. But the concepts. If there's anything I took forward from my education is the concepts, not the actual things, the actual nitty-gritty details. So that'll probably do it for now. We could spend hours talking, but I can't. Nancy?
I have a couple of questions. One is that you mentioned, and it's certainly out there as a view, that digitizing things creates more interest in the original. And I think that's true, certainly, or could be true in the museum world and with iconic objects and with maybe rare materials and so forth. Do you really think that that is true for books in general? Your example was of the espresso machine, but of course people also do have to pay for that book. And I'm just wondering if you really think that's true in libraries.
Yeah, I would argue that in general it is. And I would hold aside a few types of things. For example, edited collections, I think, don't have much future life, because if in an edited collection, typically people only want like 1 or 2 contributions out of a whole book. And so at that stage, people probably just print it on their printer and be done with it. Okay? So I don't think the print version necessarily has much life in that instance. So, you know, conference proceedings perhaps and things like that. But there's also other things like, you know, coffee table books, which, you know, online is never going to be the same. So I mean, I think there's instances on both sides of that coin where some cases the digital will completely replace the print. No one's going to bother with the print again. But I'd say for the vast majority, which are, you know, end-to-end, you know, one book by one author, typically, if someone discovers a book online that they're very interested in this book, they're going to want to read it, I would submit, still in print. I think online is useful for quick lookups, finding a bit of information, discovering if a book really is something you're interested in. But I think for long sustained reading, at least right now, still with the state of technology, it's painful online. Now that will probably change, but for now, I think it's still true. And your second?
And my second question has to do with publishing. You haven't mentioned anything about how quickly that these moves to digital are going to be, about rights and copyright and the things that are kind of obstacles to this. I'm wondering if you could comment in that area, but also it does seem that even with all of the woes that the publishers are speaking about, there is still a large amount of books on paper and other paper things being published that we are all trying to acquire. Do you see any real diminution in that?
Again, because I don't see a real drop in people's desire to have print, then I think we will have print for some time to come. However, it'll be a mixed environment. We'll have both, I think we'll both have online and print kind of coexisting together, and people will choose which format they want for a particular purpose. I published my last book through Lulu.com. Has anyone heard about Lulu View? This is a place where you can basically self-publish, and it's very cheap and easy. You basically create your book as an Adobe Acrobat file. They give you all kinds of help on formatting and all that, choose your cover, whatnot, and you upload it to their site, and they will print it on demand at a pretty reasonable cost as either a hardback or paperback. You can choose whatever it is, and they handle all of that. So it's an extremely easy and cheap way to, you know, self-publish, if you will. You can have an ISBN, you can be in Amazon. So my book for like $100 is out there in Amazon, has an ISBN, can be bought as a hardback for $30. But then also I put this online in full text for free. So people can download the PDFs or they can buy the hardcover book. And I think increasingly we will see that kind of thing happening, as well as publishers doing different kinds of things with authors. So they might, I know that I've worked with the University of California Press for a number of years in putting their content online. And they had some instances where some were open and free, and others were behind a paywall. But you could get that book either in hardback or online. The online version offering such things as powerful searching, various different displays, those kinds of things which you can't get in the print version. So I think it's a hybrid environment, and it's going to continue to be a hybrid environment, I think, for the foreseeable future. Many technical advancements do not actually kill the one that came before. It often just changes it. So like the way that TV changed radio, we go to radio for, you know, different purposes and different things than we go to TV for. So the advent of TV did not kill radio, it just changed it a bit. And it changed its niche so that it became a little different thing, but we still go to it for various purposes. So I think it's going to be the same with the digital publishing. that it's going to change how people interact with the print, but it's not going to make it go away. And I think as libraries, we have to struggle with the proper mix of print and digital, and when we get something in digital form, when we get it in print, when we get it in both. And some of those pricing models are still in our way. Publishers are still figuring out what makes sense in that environment, in this new environment. Some of them are not getting it right at all, so we're kind of left, confronted with pricing models that make no sense. And it's a difficult time. It's a very difficult transition time for both publishers and libraries, I think. Yeah.
In your opening movie, you looked forward to 2011 and 13. One of the endeavors going on at the Smithsonian right now is looking at a replacement for the integrated library system. In fact, the Circe Dynex system that we're currently using, that was on your slide, is what we're currently using. I just was curious what your thoughts would be, and maybe some advice for the system. Is, you might know, is used by archives, libraries, and museums, and special databases. So it's not just the library's catalog.
Well, okay. I'm going to give you some advice which is based from my perspective, which lacks so much information about your particular situation that you have to take that into account. So please use a massive grain of salt. But in general, and I've said this in print as well, this is a time of great ferment in the library automation market. I don't know how many of you have been kind of paying attention, but we're in kind of this massive sea change, I think. So I would say that this is a great time to stay out of the market, if you can at all do that, and kind of wait for things to shake out a bit, which I think they will do fairly soon. I mean, I think you'll be in a much different environment within 2 years. I think you will see that any choice you make right now might be regrettable in 2 years. So even if you wait like 6 months, you might have a better sense of what's going on out there. Now, having said that, you may have reasons where you have to move now, where there may be, sometimes, libraries have one chance to like spend some funds that if they don't spend them right now, they're going to go away, in which case you might just have to do it. But if you have any chance to just hold tight, I would do that myself. And you can read into that just about anything you want.
Well, that's actually the situation we're in because of the federal budget cycle anyway. So it's a long process. But
well,
yeah.
Good. Then you're in the position where you can say that that's a benefit. Because between the open source options out there, between the various financial issues happening with some of the commercial vendors, between the mergers and buyouts that keep happening, and the fact that there are other large players that might enter the market, I think it's a good time to stay out.
And actually, while I'm up here, I have one other kind of question, comment. We participated in Flickr, and one of the limitations that I see is, as an archives, photos are not our only document type, and be curious if you've begun to see sort of the development of a similar kind of system that might support a wider variety of materials and not have been built on some user group like the photographers that originally started that.
Yeah, that's a very good question that I will fail to answer well, so I might as well admit that up front. Nothing immediately jumps to mind that would be kind of the Flickr equivalent, if you will, for some of these other material types. I know that RLG, before I joined, and then after I merged with OCLC, had its various archive grid and things like that, where they tried to aggregate, at least within our own environment, information about people's archival collections and things like that. But I don't, beyond that, I'm afraid I'm a little ignorant and would defer to some of my colleagues where I work who are much more up on the archives and museums part of that to know what's up. Now, I do know we are working with museums to, and certainly you're involved with this, in trying to see how we can aggregate information about museum objects. Get them out of the silos in which they're in now, in these museum information systems, into common finding environments, for example. So we are moving that direction, but there's presently at least not a Flickr equivalent that I can name myself. And I think we've got a question up there, or on the webcast.
It's a question from, I believe, someone at Georgetown University, a reference librarian, asking for strategies about how to overcome the scarcity view in middle management.
The scarcity what in middle management?
The scarcity view that you referred to. How to relieve middle management of the relying on the scarcity model.
Oh. So the idea being that middle management doesn't quite get it, or?
That's my interpretation of this.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think that may be a little unfair to middle management, but I think there can be people at all levels of the organization that might need to consider where we need to go in the future, although there's probably few who are more well placed to do something about it than middle management, considering that they are actually the people who manage the resources, realizing that the head is probably out there fundraising or whatever. Middle management is really kind of where the rubber meets the road. And that's a difficult position to be in, frankly, because we have to all realize that there's a number of things that just happen to keep the doors open, to keep the wheels on the cart, if you will. And it's all right for a pundit like me to stand up here and say, we need to go do this, but I don't actually have to look at the balance sheet and figure out, how to take this staff person who has only done the same job for 25 years and tell that person they're going to do something completely different tomorrow. Those are very tough issues that, I shrink myself from having to tackle. So you won't find me standing here, admonishing middle management. I would hope that we could find ways to help middle management move in some of these directions in a way that will not be completely disruptive of things that need to occur on an ongoing basis, like keeping the doors open and so forth. But there will be people who are dissatisfied, people who perhaps don't want to learn new things, and we're going to have to address that. And there are going to be various ways to do that, early retirement perhaps being one of them, but not the only, certainly. Investing in our staff, actually investing in retooling them and retraining them, that may be a part of what we need to do. And a good part is going to be figuring out what can we not do, what does not need to get done. Now, that's also something which staff tend to look to middle management to tell them what not to do, but I'm actually more of a fan of making sure that you set your organizational priorities properly and that you make sure that whatever you're doing aligns with those priorities and that strategy, and then that which does not get done is what you shouldn't be doing. Because if you're properly aligned with those strategies, then the pile of work that sits over here that you never get to is in fact what you should not do. And the problem is getting people to be comfortable with that. They think that they need to get through that pile, and in fact, they never will. So just make sure that your work is aligned with the strategic priorities and do what you can every day to meet those. And back up middle management, because it's a tough, tough job that I wouldn't wish on anyone, really. Yeah.
As far as digitizing, the pre-1923 has to do with the copyright. Is that right, the 75 years?
Yes.
So as we're going into 2009 and 10 and 11, do you think that the same companies are going to continue digitizing, or does that open up a whole new area for other companies and other technologies to come in and say, all right, now I get 1924 and now I'm going to do 1925.
Well, yeah, I mean, an outfit like Google doesn't give a darn what year the book was published. They're digitizing everything. They're just not exposing in full all of those things. So the moving wall will just affect potentially what they open up. Although you can find examples right now where they don't open up stuff that seems clearly open access, and part of that, I guess, is due to just not having appropriate metadata and so forth. So I don't think it opens up opportunities for new companies necessarily, as it just means that there will be more content available for us all as that wall kind of moves and stuff becomes more available. I know the Open Content Alliance has been focusing on the open access stuff, but that will just mean that they can, digitize more of the corpus rather than less. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the future of WorldCat. As I think most people know, that the attitudes toward cataloging and have changed quite a lot in the 40 years approximately since OCLC began. And you touched on the concerns about data quality a little bit. I think the organizations that produce cataloging, from the Library of Congress on down, seem to be de-emphasizing and more reluctant to support cataloging, and there are trends to deprofessionalize it more and more. Is this a concern to OCLC as far as WorldCat is concerned? And I know in recent years, OCLC seems to have been very aggressive about building WorldCat and accepting new data. So I wonder if you could just address that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I'm not completely the right person to answer the question. Karen Calhoun is probably more appropriate, but I will give it my best shot. And certainly quality is of great importance to us, and that's why, for example, the example I used in my talk of Tom Hickey, going through programmatically and controlling those headings is one example of that. We are also studying WorldCat very closely. So, for example, I basically have an Excel spreadsheet that breaks down, for every MARC element, like, for example, how many times that occurs, how many times that it's used. So, we're looking at usage of MARC elements. We're looking at data that's in those elements. We're looking at, ways in which we might improve the data. But at the same time, we're realizing that cataloging is an expensive activity, and there may be ways that we can make it less expensive by, for example, working with publishers to get cataloging information from them that catalogers can then improve. And in fact, that's what we're doing with the Next Gen cataloging project. We're getting early data from publishers, actually improving it and giving it back to them so that they can use it for their purposes and we can use it for ours. So I think there's still ways we can squeeze some efficiencies out of it without actually deprofessionalizing or making the quality decline. I actually think that there's some things we can do to improve the quality and to enhance the cataloging, both programmatically but also, more importantly, through how would you put this, machine-enabled catalogers. So I'm a fan of tools that, for example, will look at a pile of metadata and visualize it for you. So there's various projects that are doing this. One of these at the University of North Texas. They have some tools to analyze harvested metadata in such a way that you can quickly scan through it by, for example, element or whatever, and see the occurrences of data within that element, to capture, to visualize errors that are occurring in those fields. So, for example, spelling mistakes are easy to find in tools like that. So enabling catalogers to actually improve the quality of data by being able to see it in various ways, slicing across it and down through it to enable them to understand it better and therefore improve it. So I would argue against deprofessionalization and or reducing the quality. I would argue for being smarter about what we do and using more software-enabled cataloging rather than just, you know, a print book and a card and a pen. You know, we definitely have to not do that. And no, we're not, but that's just an example, an analogy.
Would you foresee any time in the future where WorldCat might become irrelevant?
Well, boy. I mean, anything can become irrelevant, but I can't see out far enough. And by that, I don't mean like many years. I mean like, you know, 5, 10 years. And when you think about the internet, I mean, as Nancy said, my book, Crossing the Internet Threshold, was one of the first 10 books published on the internet in this country. It was published in 1992. That was 16 years ago. It had a 1993 copyright date, but it was in November or in the fall of 1992 when we published that. So 16 years, you know, think of what the last 16 years have held. So I can't predict much beyond a few years, and even then I think it's rocky. So potentially yes, but I can't give you a time horizon at all. Thank you.
Any other questions? And please join me in thanking Roy for a very
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, webcast folks.